Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jenny Johnson,
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
and today we are talking about lives that have
Mhm.
stories that are almost always forgotten, sadly. But our guest today um, has taken some of those stories, she's actually put them into a book, and she is still continuing to try and make sure these particular stories aren't completely lost and forgotten. And it's definitely a lot of heart that goes into all this. So we want to welcome to the show today Amy Shea.
Welcome, Amy.
So
Thank
welcome, Amy. And
you.
Amy is a writer. She's written many essays, done lots of things, but she wrote a book recently called Too Poor to Die: The Hidden Realities of Dying in the Margins. And she really, you really dug deep into some of these stories and um, the people, unhoused people, people who, and some of them weren't even completely unhoused in a lot of cases, but they don't have any resources. They don't have any family. They have nobody to care for them at the end of their life. And it ends up being a very sad situation for them. And then, as we always say, it's important to share the stories. Their stories really do kind of get erased by the time all is said and done. And you've been very touched by this whole community, and you went in and you made something so that people can become more aware of the situation.
That's correct.
So tell us what led you to start this book. Not necessarily, I know what led you. I read your introduction and how you didn't like this question initially, but this is one of those topics that unless you work in a shelter or you work in maybe a hospital situation, you're not around this particular population as much. So it's not something a lot of people want to even think about. So
So how did I get into it?
yes.
Yeah, I always, and the reason I talked about in my introduction why I was so kind of scared by this question was that it was so complicated and messy. And
Mm-hmm.
it is complicated and messy. And that's scary. And that's like, how do you explain this in a way that makes sense to people and doesn't sound like someone just rambling nonsense? And I kind of came to the realization that part of it is that death is messy and complicated, and being unhoused or being in poverty and coming to the end of your life can also be very messy and complicated, and to maybe not shy away from that complexity so much as far as describing why I got into this. And um, so there's sort of these three strands. It really started when my grandmother died in 2012. She was the last living grandparent I had, and I was in my early 30s when she passed. And I was having grief dreams and like all these things, and I absolutely did not feel entitled to that grief. I was like, she's a grandparent. People were like, of course, your grandmother died. She was in her 80s. There's sort of this sense
Oh,
of
yeah.
like, it did, I was like, well,
Right.
it didn't feel like the level of grief that I was having, like that I should be allowed to have that. I know that, sounds kind of crazy, but I think people know what I mean, and that could be in reference to any kind of grief you have that you don't feel entitled to. And so I kind of fell, and I fell into researching about it and reading about it. And the next thing I knew, I was in, knee deep, neck deep in the death positivity movement, right? Reading everything possible, reading all the literature, um, and kind of really coming to this conclusion that, really what was happening was that, I was in my early 30s and I had been so lightly touched by death and that was kind of like, wait a minute, stop, pause.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of shocking in itself. And, like I had very little death in my life, and in and getting to that death positive movement and kind of understanding, right, that there are, within our modern American world, that death can be quite hidden for some people. But in thinking about that, at the same time that was all happening, my dad was doing research down in my hometown in Fresno, California. And he was mapping out all of the cemeteries in Fresno County for the Genealogy Society at the library. And he was retired. He retired early, and this was sort of his passion project. And they were trying to create this big database so that if anyone came looking for a great granddad or somebody, they would have that information. And in the process of doing that, they came in contact with the county and the coroner, who said, "Oh, hey, we've got these boxes stacked up in the corner. They belong, all these records are from our county cemeteries or the Potter's Field. And we don't really know what to do with them, and we don't want them, and they're taking up space." And so my dad took all of this and put it into the spreadsheet in addition to doing the kind of all the other cemeteries. And so he was telling me about this, and I was living in Boston at the time, and I would come back like once or twice a year. And I'm like, what the heck is a Potter's Field? What do you mean? What? And so he took me, the first time he took me was really interesting because that was the ultimate like first impression. And this was happening like right, I think this actually happened before my grandmother died, but he was working on this as her death was coming upon us as well. But the first time we went, we actually didn't go into the county cemetery because we weren't actually sure if we could get in. So we went into the Catholic cemetery where my great grandparents were buried, and that was adjacent to it. And we
Mhm.
went up to the fence and looked through. And I just like that image was stuck in my mind because all you saw was a dirt field with nothing but mare's tails, these really tall weeds. And my dad's like, "That's it." And I'm like, "That." And it was also connected in that same lot was the old Chinese cemetery that had also kind of fallen to disrepair.
Mhm.
And I think that says a lot about, racial and cultural inequities as well. And and you're just like, you wouldn't know it was a cemetery. And so that in itself I was just like, wow. And I was trying to wrap my brain around all of this. And then, like I said, my grandmother died. I got into this death positive stuff. I was thinking about all the stuff my dad was doing in the Potter's Fields. I was volunteering in homeless shelters. And as a writer and as an essayist, I started to become attuned to looking for connections and these things. And these three things all just merged. And I was like, I'm having these conversations. I'm going to death cafes and I'm reading all these articles and these essays and these books about how I want to die well and what's advanced directives and all these things and green burial, etc. And yet there's a whole swath of our population that does not have access to that conversation at all.
Nope.
And that is not even sometimes in people's purview when we're thinking about that. And when I would tell people about Potter's Fields, they'd be like, "What is that?" Or I would get, "Isn't that something like an old-timey thing that they used to do?" Like, a- and it stuck. I couldn't get out of like being haunted. I couldn't get away from being haunted by that. And I had a writing professor once say to me, "Right where the heat is." And I kept coming back to that. And I had written the first essay that became this book. I titled it, well, Pushing Up Mare's Tails, because it was all I could think in my head was, you think pushing up daisies, there is nothing pretty
Mhm.
happening over in that cemetery. It has
Right.
just been left to whatever. And yeah, and it just kind of snowballed from there. And that was 2012, 2013. I wrote that essay. And here we are.
In 2025.
Like my life. And there's a book.
But it also shows just how long this, like
Yeah.
you said, this evolved from a bunch of little things that became what it is now in your book. Um, the thing that strikes me about especially some of the other stories you have in the book, is a lot of the people you're talking about. They are part of the homeless community, the community, the unhoused. They don't have family anymore, or they don't have a connection to their families anymore for whatever reasons. And as a society, we tend to push the homeless away as it is, right? Like we don't want to see
Mhm.
it, we don't want to acknowledge it, we don't want to know it's there, it's ugly and whatever. And so we did that, and we're still doing that to them after they die. We push them away in these potter's fields, and they don't get, I mean, I understand why they don't get headstones. Headstones are expensive even for a lot of people who can afford them,
Right.
let alone trying to get one for every single person who died who didn't have anybody else there besides maybe somebody at a shelter or somebody at the hospital with them in that moment. but um and even some of them, didn't even have that much of a person. So I feel like it's the whole situation, it's like our dirty little secret that we keep pushing under the rug. And there are people that want to do things about it, but it's trying to get a larger population to open up to see that there needs to be more done for this entire community. And it's not just in California, and it's not just in New York. This is a problem from coast to coast in our country. Like
Absolutely.
small towns, big cities, doesn't matter. Everybody's got some of this
Mhm.
happening where they live.
Yeah, absolutely. And and the one thing I talk about in the book too is the book sort of has that starts with that broader focus, right, of the potter's field and kind of just po funeral poverty in general. And people who end up in, well, and I'll backtrack a little bit. I still sometimes say Potter's Field, but I'm hearing kind of rumblings around that not being a great phrase. And I understand the reasonings behind that. So I think sometimes I might say Potter's Field, but also, there's county disposition, right? So when the
Right,
county's taking, or the whatever the region of that, if the state doesn't have counties, like a parish, et cetera,
right,
when the government is sort of taking control of the situation. And people end up in county cemeteries or county disposition programs for a number of different reasons. There are people obviously who are just unidentified, and that's pretty
right,
rare, especially these days. But then there are also folks who who die and have no next of kin that can be found.
Mhm.
And so that and no financial resources. So they have neither. Because
right,
sometimes if someone dies and there's no next of kin able to be located, but there are financial resources, and maybe there's a pre-need or something else in place. Oftentimes counties can work to have them buried or interred elsewhere, cremated, et cetera, whatever it might be elsewhere, depending on what kind of what financials are available. But then there are people who, die and they are able to find next of kin, and those next of kin
Mhm.
don't want to pay, don't want, didn't like him alive, don't like him dead,
right.
nothing to do with them, or they just can't afford to pay for it. And that's actually, I think, the most common scenario.
Hmm.
I think one of the real common misconceptions is that people who end up in county disposition programs have no one. And that is true for a lot of people, but there are also a lot of people who do have family, and unfortunately, there is just no way to pay, and so they end up, in a potter's field. And so I start with that broad concept, and then I really start narrowing down and looking particularly at people who die while experiencing homelessness, because to me, that's sort of like when you look at the rungs of poverty and that lack of access, that's sort of you're hitting kind of like that bottom rung where people are really disenfranchised. And like you say, they're pushed to the limits and to the outer edges of our towns and our cities. Shelters are often put in places that are not within areas of commerce or
Right,
where there's public transportation. They're not put in places that help people get out of homelessness. And then, it's this whole trajectory, right? Issues of lacking access to health care, having a continuity of care, and eventually leading to this trajectory of potentially ending up in a county cemetery because there's no money to be had and no one to claim them. And so it's like, I think partly what I'm trying to discuss within this book without getting too big is, people don't just end up in a potter's field. Like that doesn't happen in a vacuum. You don't just
right.
end up in county disposition out of nowhere. There's usually like there have been a series of steps that have led someone there. And so there's this real inequity. And one of the things I talk about in that first chapter, because I start seeing these parallels when you think about, the way I think especially like the news and the media will talk about homeless people, and we talk, a lot of it is I don't really hear a lot of conversations around how do we solve it as much as how do we not see it.
Yep.
And I get it. It's a very complex issue. It's not something that's easily solvable. But yeah, it's like that sort of policing where people can be physically when they're alive. We're seeing lots of criminalizing of homelessness. We're kind of swinging back the pendulum, swinging back, and there's a lot of laws that have come into place recently that are allowing for, criminalizing of homelessness, not allowing encampments, and there's a lot of sweeps that get done, and people are literally being swept out of areas and into other cities, neighboring cities, or off to the edges. And then again, that happens in death, where they're being put in these places. And in both cases, I think with homelessness in general, it's sort of both very visible and very hidden. And then there's a sense of like with the Polaris fields, they are also very hidden. I don't know that they're visible actually, because I think that's, there's not necessarily a lot of awareness about, what happens to someone when they don't have the financial means to pay for private internment. Um, and so yeah, it's just trying to start having that conversation around like, how what happens and how we are affecting people's lives and their deaths when we are really preventing them from being physically in place, like we are saying, you can't be here, you can't be there.
Mhm.
I think of even like the story I tell in the book about a guy, Somerville Mike, this homeless man that was in Somerville where I lived. And he came into the bar where I was at, and the bartender's like, "No, you can't come, you can't be in here." And it's just sort of like there's so many situations like that. I think that people who are unhoused experience, and then like you said, it's just sort of, guy. I'm going to use a pun, but it's like the nail in the coffin as far as at the end of life.
Yeah. And the other part of that is also I always think, and I used to think about this a lot. I worked for many years. I worked in a dental office in a neighborhood where we had a very large low income population. So a lot of our elderly patients were definitely on very fixed incomes. They had Medicaid. Their dental care was not covered essentially unless they needed a tooth pulled. They could get all their teeth pulled all day long and that was fine. Could we do anything else for them? No. And they couldn't afford anything else. And fortunately, one of the dentists I work for, a lot of times he'd be like, I'm not doing that. I'm just not going to charge them. We're just going to do this dental work
Mhm.
because their quality of life would have been even worse than the situation they were already in because they wouldn't have had teeth. And it's one of those situations where I saw that over and over and over again with those people. And so many, and these were in a lot of cases, these were elderly people who did not have family nearby anymore. They didn't have, if they had children, they maybe didn't have a relationship with those children anymore
Mhm.
for whatever reasons. And so they were alone. And you always worried what was going to happen, when they, and in a lot of cases, these people did have somewhere they were living, but they were going to die alone most likely in their chair or in their bed or whatever. And how long is it going to be before somebody discovers that they were there by themselves because there's nobody checking up on them on a regular basis. And I think it's even worse if you're unhoused altogether. And you mentioned it a few times, like there have been plenty of times where somebody's been found near a dumpster or, on a stoop because they froze to death or they just, their health was so poor at that point, their body just gave out. And so, and sometimes we see those stories in the news. A lot of times we don't. The county, like you said, the county comes in, they clean it up, they dispose of it, and it's just done.
Yeah,
And
I mean, you see
that's
it
all
with
we, yeah.
like the sensational stories. Like like
Mm-hmm.
the man who died in the Tim Hortons up in Canada, and
Right.
sitting at the table, and or the man who died in the dumpster. You hear those kind of really sensationalized things. You hear less about, yeah, someone who maybe just died in an alleyway, or under a bridge, or in a homeless encampment.
Or you might find one tiny little, there might be a little sliver of you know, remains found, whatever, and we never hear anything else about it. And we lose the humanity behind that then because one, we're not giving these people a name. They had names. We're not using their names if we even know their names. And they're just remains. And then they're just moved from one thing to another. And so we take away the again even more of their dignity. They've already lost a lot of it in so many of these situations, and we're taking it away even more by not having better resources for handling these deaths when they happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was probably the thing that struck me the most at first with all this, and has continued to stay with me, is the lack of naming, the lack of memorialization, and to some extent that happens, at least from the wider like community or the county, right?
Mhm.
It is kind of cool when you go into some of these places and you'll see the rituals and the memorializations happening because family members have come or friends or, maybe just some community members who know and care. And so like I think about the cemetery in Kentucky and Louisville and all the homemade headstones and they were made from you saw people like old siding
Uh-huh.
signs, like there was a handicap sign was one of them. Lots of different signs to try to memorialize somebody, and lots of things left behind, especially like on the children's section. There's always lots of toys and figurines and I guess in some ways there's I think at least thankfully it does at least from the ones I've seen. I can't speak to every cemetery like county cemetery, but the ones that I've been to, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of policing in terms of not allowing people to come in and put things in. So I've
Right.
seen people put like full on grave markers or headstones. You've seen those in there and other things. But but it's not happening on that wider sense, right? Like you said, it's not visible to someone who's not necessarily touched by this, even though I think we're all affected by it. And I think, that's where it really stuck with me because I thought that memorialization is important because we talk about, the measure of a society based on how we treat our dead. And I think even more so is how we treat our dead when no one's looking.
Mhm.
Because when you look at some things like a county cemetery or even people who die while incarcerated, et cetera, those aren't visible. Like you said, people aren't seeing that. And so really it's like, how do you behave when no one's watching you? In addition to, how we just kind of come together as a community. They were still community members. They are still important parts of our society. And to just not, like you said, I understand the logistics to some extent, right? Headstones are
Right.
very expensive. But even in Kentucky, like in Louisville, in the one cemetery, they had a board, and it was like and they had it printed out, everyone's names who'd been buried there. So
Hmm.
there are ways to
That's
do it.
something.
Hmm.
Mhm.
And um, so there are ways to do that. And also the one in Fresno, there is a headstone that funeral home director donated because he was also a stonemason, and they covered one plot or maybe a couple plots that had about 10 years worth of people who'd been buried there, and they engraved all those names and put that
Wow.
down. Right. So there are ways to maybe connect with the community from a volunteer standpoint or like getting, other people involved. Maybe it doesn't have to be an official thing that the county pays and does for. But I do think that's so important. And I've talked about this in the book, but, just you think about 9/11 and every year, we're coming up on that and every year. People stand and name out every single one of those almost 3,000 names, and it takes a while. And when you're talking about, significantly fewer names that need to be read or listed or named somewhere beyond maybe a record that's hidden, in a file somewhere in a
Right.
basement, um, why can't that, like, I just, that really bothers me that we, like, how do we get get engagement in that way. And I do think part of it though is again, it's hard to care about something if you don't know about it. And
Mhm.
because this is often so hidden, I think a lot of people just aren't aware. And so I think that's partly what I'm doing is like, hey, there's
Hmm.
this thing happening, and how do we, recognize community members who have passed, even if they aren't, quote, productive members of society, right? Because I think sometimes there's a sense of, well, they're homeless or they're in poverty, and we don't want to see that. We don't want to talk about it. Like you said, it's a dirty little secret. But I think it's even in that case even more important to name people, or just as important.
When you would think, I mean, in our modern era with our technology, even at the county cemeteries and those places, we could have a QR code where you could scan it and go
That's
to
a
it
great
and have a
idea.
list of names. Like they've already got it in their records anyway, so why not make that so that it's accessible to the public? And that also would help somebody say, you do have somebody who died and you couldn't contact next of kin. But at some point, there are times where next of kin is actually trying to hunt somebody down.
Yeah.
Now they might actually be able to find them. Not that they necessarily wanted to find that they had died, but now they know kind of where they're at,
Where
where
they're
they
at.
ended up, and maybe they can get a few more answers to that person's story and have that for themselves because now they're going to go through a different sort of grief process now that they've discovered that their loved one is gone. So it create, I would just think that couldn't be that hard or expensive to do.
Yeah, and I agree. And I do, I mean, and not to vilify, these poor county workers. I think like this isn't there aren't like these bad individuals who don't want to do things. I
No.
mean, people are overworked and underpaid and all of it. It's a systemic issue,
Oh yeah.
right? And you're right though. It's like, is there a way to like as a community support, like where we can say, hey, how do we get a QR code up and have some place where people can access those names more readily? If we can't put up a sign or a headstone, can we have somewhere where that is more visible publicly? Um, and it's interesting because in Fresno, and I write about this in the book, and I went to the Mass Memorial in 2018. Um, since then, because I was thinking, okay, my understanding was every 4 to 5 years they hold one of these, and in 2018 they had accidentally skipped so they've been gone 9 years, I think, and
Mm.
that's why they had so many people they had to bury. But I was like, okay, well, we're at that that point. We're past it now. What's happening? And so my dad and I were looking into this, and it turns out sometime shortly, we're not quite sure when, but it seems pretty shortly after the 2018 burial, they shifted to sending the cremated remains up to the Bay Area to go out to sea in Marin County. So they're no longer
Oh,
burying them in Fresno. And we were like, sorry, what? And so, you're trying to ask questions and you're trying to find out more information. And it's, again, I haven't fully verified this, but it seems like so they send the cremated remains up to the Bay Area. They're sent out to sea. So that means that up in the Bay Area in Marin County is where that record is kept. But our understanding is that they're only kept for a year. So my next question, and we haven't been able to get answered, is what happens after a year? Because like you were saying, what if someone comes later looking
Right.
for a family member? And we haven't gotten those answers yet. We haven't gotten that information. It can be really difficult to find this kind of information out. One of the things I've done since working on this book is I helped found a group called Equitable Disposition Alliance. And we recently got funding from the Order of the Good Death to create a publicly shared database of the county disposition programs around the country. And we're trying to aim for about two per state because we realize like this is a huge undertaking.
right.
We started this, I think in earnest. We had a bunch of volunteers join to help, do this research. And we started maybe in like May, and we have like 25 of the states
Oh, that's
so far.
awesome.
Oh, that
Yeah,
is good.
but it has been quite the journey. Some places it's really easy to find that information, and sometimes it's also about knowing somebody. If someone says, "Hey,"
Right.
like I was referred to someone in Denver, and so I was able to talk to someone there, and I heard all about the amazing work that they do for their county. But I called another county here in California, and I won't name them, um, but when I called, I left a message. She called me back, and sort of her first question was like, "Who are you and what do you want? What are you going to do with this information? Our lawyers are worried about this, and my boss is concerned. Like, where's this information going?" And I'm
Wow.
thinking, this is public information.
That's
And
where
so
I'd
the
be a
next
little suspicious when they're like, our lawyers are worried about this. I'm like, well, if these people died of natural causes or whatever, then it shouldn't be
would be an issue.
anything to be worried about, right?
And so it's really interesting, right? So then she's like, kind of her next comment was, if you want detailed information, basically do a FOIA, right? Like a Freedom of Information Act. And I'm like, that's a very aggressive legal move, but okay. And so we were talking, and I kind of like tried to explain. I was like, I'm trying to put this into this database, and she's okay. She's like, here, I can tell you what I would say if you were a family member calling up asking about someone. I'm like, that's great. I'm like, I just want the basics. How long do you hold the body? What kind of disposition method do you use? Where are they interred? Is there any
Mhm.
financial public assistance? And she gave me all that information. And it turns out what they were doing was, I think, because you start to hear like people get cagey and you think, what is there to be ashamed of? And I understand there's this stigma around like, or this thought of like maybe what they're doing seems, you know, just inequitable, right? It's kind of unsavory in a way. But at the end of the day, when she was talking about what they do, I was like, oh, it's actually not, I mean, so bad. They mentioned that if they could find financial resources, they worked really hard to then try and find a family plot where that person could be interred so that they
Hmm.
didn't have to go into the county cemetery.
Right.
This is in California. In California, state law, is that you hold a body for 30 days while you look for somebody, like next of kin, etc. If they find family sooner, then you only have to hold the body 10 to 18 days before you cremate. So like if the family says go, we don't want it or we can't afford to pay, you don't have to hold it the full 30 days. But this county holds it that full 30 days regardless of
Wow.
whether they find
Oh,
family.
that's nice.
So doing all these things, and so I'm thinking, why are you also worried? Especially when it's public information and it's not like you're doing anything particularly shady. And I don't know sometimes where that comes from. I think they're just worried about, maybe being portrayed in a particular light.
Hmm.
But yeah,
Well,
it's
maybe they don't want to be portrayed as it looks almost like a business kind of deal type situation. But when you're as the county, you're dealing
Hmm.
with numbers. Like you don't have a choice because it's a number of people. And depending on your county, your population, those numbers could be pretty big. And so you have to have a system, unfortunately,
yeah.
to be efficient and to also, I mean, we're talking about the dead. We can only keep them for so long. And for health reasons, we have to do something like, and there's only so much you can do before you have to cremate them and have to move them
Yeah.
on.
And
Um,
30
and
days is quite a long time.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I think in Massachusetts it's 2 weeks or
yeah.
12 days. It's not quite as long.
I'm sure it's different. Every state and every
Yeah.
county has
Mhm.
their rules. But yeah, like you said, they're not doing anything wrong, but maybe they just don't want to be seen as maybe not being kind
Well,
enough towards these
yeah.
dead or whatever. But I don't think that's and in the majority of cases, I don't think that's ever what's going
No,
on
I
for
don't either.
most in most cases. It's we're doing the best we can with the resources that we
Right,
have, and that's
exactly.
everybody. We're doing what we can, and again, it's just something that's not talked about unless you're the one that deals with that on the daily basis. That's your job in the county, or you work in the hospitals or whatever. The rest of us don't see it, and we're not thinking about it in that way.
Yeah, and a lot of people like to judge things they don't understand or they're not involved in because you really don't know all that's involved until you are actually in it. And then it's a totally different picture and world until when you're working it to see actually what happens
Yeah,
and
I
why it
mean,
happens the way it does.
as you say, right? It's like you logistically you have to do something.
Hmm.
Especially, Fresno gets 100, on average 100 bodies a year that go unclaimed. LA is getting over 1,000. What do you do? You have to
Right.
do
Yeah.
something. And I get it, I agree. I think that is it. I think people are worried it looks like a transaction
Hmm.
but it is just, it's a logistical thing. And so I completely empathize with that.
And I think too, for the people, like you had to call the lady and talk to her, and she was putting up barriers at first. It was real harsh, but I also think she's protecting herself a little bit because this is what she has to do every day.
Hmm.
And if she gets the one like you were very patient and very kind with her, and you took the time to explain why you wanted to do it. But if you had somebody who, say a parent that was looking for a child, they could they're already grieving, they're already scared, they're already all these emotions, and that could come out over the phone, in which case this person has had to learn to probably put some barriers in place to protect themselves from that type of emotional outburst that could happen during these conversations.
So
Sure.
in
And
the
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask in the Potter's Field that you're familiar with, do they list the names if they have the names? Is there a database where
Um, for the Fresno one,
the
there
names can
was.
be researched?
Yeah, for the Fresno one, there was up at like I said up until about 2018. And I actually that is something I can share. My dad and I can't take any credit for this. I joke that my dad deserves like an honorary PhD, and his name should probably be on this book because he helped with that aspect a lot. He had this database already. By the time I started the doctorate and started working on this, it was 2017, and so he'd already pulled that all together, and it is up online for people to see who is
That's
currently
awesome.
buried. in both of the county cemeteries in Fresno. But again, since they've changed the way they do things in
Yeah.
2018, that's where we now don't, we're not getting clear answers as to where those records are being held. But
Mm.
yeah, my understanding is they should be like, and I take this from an essay, and I know the writer. There's an essay called Indigent Disposition by Christopher Notar Nicola, and I love it. It's a really short piece, and it's so evocative. And it's about Broward County, Florida, where he was living, and they take people out to sea there. So they cremate, take them out to sea, and they save the coordinates because they'll take them
Oh,
out
that's
by
cool.
boat. So if you do call post interment into the sea, you can at least get that. And that's currently what, and I have not had a lot of time to dig into it right now, but it's something that's sort of on my to-do list once all this other stuff, book stuff dies down, is to figure out if that's what they would, if they're doing something similar when
Yeah.
bringing them up to Marin County. And then also, is it true that they're only holding those records for a year, or are they being archived somewhere else
I
after
would,
that?
I would
I
hope
would
so.
yeah, I would certainly hope so. 'Cause that
I
would
would hope so
be
too.
a
And yeah,
disservice.
it's interesting you mentioned too, like, how do people finding out about someone going in, like a loved one going into one of these, going into a potter's field. And there was a story that came out. So during the memorial in Fresno in 2018, a family showed up, and it was a man named Raymond Mata, and he hadn't been unhoused. He had a family. He was almost, I think he had kids. I don't know if he was married, but he was part of a family. But anyway, he became slightly disenfranchised from them, some said, and died. But they knew he had died. They actually, but the county had him cremated. But then the family started arguing over who could, like, there was there on like only one person in the family was listed as being eligible to collect those remains.
Mm.
And there was a huge fight over it. That person never
Oh, geez.
collected them. And so then by the time they found out, they'd already interred him because they only put out those names about 3 weeks before the memorial had happened.
Mm.
And with Fresno, once you're interred, you don't come back out.
Right.
In Denver, I've learned that's not the case. They will, if some family comes out of the woodwork 5 years later, they will disinter and give the family the remains back, or if they bury them, etc.
Yeah, and again, that's one of those and we've talked about this on other episodes. Burial rules are different from state to state and county to county. And so,
Cemetery to cemetery.
and cemetery to cemetery,
Yeah.
yeah. Everybody has their own rules.
And someone says, aren't there federal rules? And I'm like, no.
Nope.
And like I to some extent can understand that could be difficult because things are so different from place to place. But some basic protocols or guidelines that, we could follow that are kind
Yeah,
of,
the closest we have to anything federally involved would be our national cemeteries, and that's about it.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
um,
And
and
that is, and so people who are known veterans do not end up in Parsfields. Fields. They will, of course, go to a veterans cemetery.
yes,
Yeah, they'll make that effort.
but yeah,
Yeah, that
there's
is the one thing. There, no veteran should ever is supposed to ever be buried in a potter's field.
Mhm.
But then I'm sure it happens if they don't know they're a veteran, or
mhm,
I'm sure it happens.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that with the access to information we have these days, if you can find out who the person is, you should be
Right.
able to find that out. But I'm sure that, that hasn't always been the case. We haven't always, been easily able to, find information out about people. And that's why I think also you don't get so many unidentified folks anymore. I think it's hard to really be truly off the grid like that. But you're right. I'm sure it has happened,
Oh
not
yeah.
yeah,
intentionally, of course.
yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing I was hoping we could talk a little bit about, and this doesn't actually have to do with burial. This is before we get that far, but I was kind of intrigued by it when I was reading. And actually, the introduction to your book was written by the lady who directs it, but it's the organization called INN Between, and
Mhm.
it's sort of like a hospice place for a lot of these people where they can go and they can actually get caregivers to take care of them until they pass. And so, and then you have somebody that's handling all the after stuff too. And I thought that was so wonderful and beautiful and such a wonderful thing. And I wish more communities had that sort of organization like that. So I was hoping you
Yeah.
would talk a little bit more about that. And
Yeah, oh my God. So Jillian Olmsted is the executive director at the In-Between. And so first of all, she is like a powerhouse. It's just amazing the work that they are doing. That whole organization is just blows my mind how awesome they are. And yeah, it's a hospice foreign housing. That's how a hospice foreign house people. That's how it started. And then it expanded beyond hospice to medical respite, which are not necessarily people who are at the end of their life. They're not sick enough to be in the hospital, but they're sort of too
right,
sick to be on the streets. So, like if you have a broken leg or you're going through chemo or something like that, and while those folks are in the medical rescue unit, they are often working hard to try and get them housing, so they don't have to go back out onto the street when they're done. But yeah, they've got this whole hospice unit, and they're the largest hospice for unhoused in the United States. There are other organizations around the country. There's one in Madison, Wisconsin. Um, there is one that's just opened in Sacramento, and gosh, they're all over. There's one in Washington D.C., but they're small, and there's one in Denver called Rocky Mountain Refuge. But like
mhm,
the Madison and the Denver one only have beds for about 3 or 4 people.
right.
So they're much
Oh, wow.
smaller.
They're small.
Circle of the City down in Phoenix is a medical respite with a couple of hospice palliative care beds. And they partner with an outside hospice. But yeah, the in between is they've just done amazing work. And some of the things, I mean, I walked in there and I said, "Can I die here?" Like just like if I'm coming to the end of my life, can someone ship me to Utah, please? Because this is just the most amazing place. Like immediately walking in, like it was so warm and vibrant. They have a lot of volunteers that come in and help. They've got an amazing nursing staff. They have a dietitian on staff. They talked about how, sometimes people come off the streets onto hospice with them and get off of it because they
Hmm.
actually just finally had respite and could get food and sleep and
And get
go there.
healthy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they weren't actually necessarily dying, at least imminently, to be on hospice. But they do so many great things. They've got the NODA, which is No One Dies Alone program. And
Which I
so
love.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I love that they even say, I think it's on their website, I saw this, if someone doesn't want to die alone, right? Because some people do.
Right.
Some people don't necessarily want someone there with them. And I think what I really appreciate is that it's more about just respecting someone's agency and choice, regardless of what they want and whether it fits in with your societal norms or whatever. Like if they don't want, but if they want to have somebody there, they can. And they tell the story in the book. They talk about a man who, as he was dying, he wanted someone to be holding his hand. And so they lined volunteers up basically, and someone would sit with him and hold his hand. And when that person needed a break, they would transfer that guy's hand to the other volunteer's hand. So he was never not having that human touch because that's what he wanted. And I
Mhm.
think, wow, this is the kind, just to be able, and that's the thing when we talk within like, death cafes and all these other places about how I want to die, that shouldn't be reserved to people who have time to think about that or who have the
Right.
money to pay someone to help them with those things. But that should just be like a human right,
Mhm.
is to have human touch or have a song playing or have quiet and no one in the room or have it cooler or warmer whatever and so I think the in-between does a really good job of really making space for people to die as dignified and how they want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was, like I
Wow.
said, I was reading about them and I was like, I wish there was one of these everywhere, like
Mhm.
that could to do what they're doing. And like you said, they were able to expand
Mhm.
into the palliative care treatment and really help some of these other folks. And hopefully, in a lot of cases, maybe even get them off the street so that they can
Hmm.
actually finally get better and then stay better.
Yeah.
Or in the instance, because there was the one story towards the end of the book where the gentleman did get better, they did get him housing, and he still ended up dying,
Mhm.
but he was in an armchair with the blanket over him, like he was warm and he
Oh,
was comfortable. He wasn't out
wasn't
on the
on the
street
street.
somewhere freezing cold and
Yeah.
uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it just, it's funny because I think the woman who was telling that story was like, some people hear that and think, oh, that's so terrible. He died alone. They're like, no, no, no. He was off the streets. He was in his
Yeah.
own home,
He was safe and
watching
comfortable.
ESPN,
Yeah.
right? 'Cause that's what he wanted to be doing. And like that's all I think we're asking, right? Is that people have that opportunity. And you know, and there's also the man they talk about down in Santa Monica who didn't want to die in the hospital and said, "Nope, send me back. I don't want treatment for my cancer. Send me back out. I'm gonna go drink in the park with my buddies, and if I die sooner, so be it. I don't want to be away from my community when I'm getting sick and dying. I don't want to be hooked up to machines." And I think again, it just is coming down to being able to ask people what they want and being able to provide that to the best of, your ability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I know for some of us it can be hard depending on what the individual wants
Mhm.
in our own minds, and we're like, well, that's not what I would want. And we have to remember it's not about us at that point, it's
Right.
about the other person.
Yeah.
And I hope that we are as a society starting to get a little bit better about that. We because of the death positivity movements and things like that, we are having more conversations about death and dying, and it's not so secretive anymore. But I think, I mean, there's still a long way to go. And like you said yourself, but when you first started really on this journey, you hadn't been touched by death a lot, and there's still a lot of people who haven't
Yeah.
had to worry about it,
Right.
or children who've lost grandparents, but maybe they were so little when the grandparents
Mhm.
died they never got to know them, they just heard about them or whatever. So by the time they grew up and finally lost somebody they really cared about, they went years before it was even part of what they had to do. And so I think, and this is just another aspect of that, this particular population of people that again we kind of push under the rug, they they deserve better than that too.
And when you're chronically unhoused, particularly, I mean, death is not a stranger necessarily,
Mm-mm.
right? There's a lot
Right.
of potential death that they're seeing of their friends and their community members from violence, from drugs, and as
Yeah.
I mentioned in the book, a lot of people are not necessarily dying of overdoses and the things we assume. They're dying of heart disease and cancer
Mhm.
and all the other things, but they're dying of those at a much younger age, sometimes on average 20 years younger than a housed person would.
Right.
Um, and it was so interesting when I was doing the research for this book initially, and I was so frustrated because I was like trying to find, like scholarly journal articles, like medical and nursing texts about what happens to, what do people who are unhoused, like what do they think about death and dying? What do they think about in life? What's happening? And I found some, but there wasn't a lot. And so I ended up trying to find more tangential stuff and then kind of bringing that together and thinking it through. But there were a couple of really interesting pieces. And, in one article, they actually asked them straight up those questions, what do you want when you die? What do you consider to be a good death? What kind of memorialization do you want? Where would you want, all of those questions that we would ask of other people. And, I think, we give space to, but it was one study and I think they interviewed like 20 people at a shelter. And like, we
Yeah.
need to hear that. I think people need to hear that, like you said, the humanity of people, right? That these
Mhm.
aren't these aren't just people we throw away. They are humans who do have the same fears and wants and other needs and things that we do. Just because you're unhoused doesn't mean you don't deserve that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Amy, thank you so much.
Thank you. This
Thank you
was,
again.
yeah.
We will have links to the book in the show notes. It's definitely a good read. And so if you want to know more about this particular side of death, which, as we've said here this whole time, is really important to get to know a little bit more about, read Amy's book. I will also link, there's some good organizations that she mentions in the book. I'm going to link them in the show notes as well. So if you want more resources, if you know somebody who's going through these struggles and you want to be able to offer them some help, hopefully this puts you on the right path. Or if you want to get involved
Involved.
and start being
Exactly.
one of these volunteers for things, or whether it's volunteering at a shelter, whether it's volunteering to help with the records organizations and all the research that goes into that, there's a lot of different ways to get involved. So we'll include some of that in our show notes. Amy, do you have any final words you want to leave our listeners with?
No, I think, like I said, I think for me, this book isn't about providing answers as much as it is asking questions and wanting other people to sit with those questions and, thinking about what we want in death versus what we get based on what we have access to. And like you said, get out there, volunteer, maybe it's even asking your county if you can come, if you have a choir, come sing at a memorial service, or like you
Oh,
said,
yeah.
looking up records or whatever it might be. or if nothing else, talking about it a little bit more, and thinking about
Mhm.
it, making some space for it. So yeah, no, I appreciate you guys allowing me to come on and talk about
Thank you.
this and spread the word.
We will definitely do that. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about today's episode, visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you'll find additional links in our show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Your support helps others find our show and discover all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories.
You can also follow us on social media for cemetery facts, photos, quotes, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery. If you'd like to help support us financially, you can donate a cup of coffee by clicking on the coffee cup icon on our website or YouTube, or purchase some of our fabulous Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery merchandise through our store link.
Until we meet again.